This podcast is brought to you by Tri-Velo Coaching, where we help triathletes and cyclists like you train smarter to race faster. I'm your host, Jordan Donnelly, and on my left is former Australian Ironman Champion and head coach of Tri-Velo Coaching, Gerard Donnelly. Today we are looking at bike versus run training, the comparison between the two and what is the difference. Should you train the run leg and the bike leg differently? And more specifically, what sort of sessions are best suited for running and what sort of sessions are best suited for the bike. And we see a lot of athletes doing what we call over-under sessions all the time on the bike and not doing any sustained threshold riding, which is what you call the weakness on the bike. And we also see a lot of athletes do a lot of threshold running, but not a lot of over-under sessions in terms of run training. So today we're going to explore the different types of sessions you can do and what's best for your program. But firstly, Dad, welcome to the episode, our starting segment. What are you grateful for?
I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful to do a recovery ride. I suppose I would have said that if I was in the middle of hard training. Yeah. Couldn't wait for a recovery ride, but I'm grateful after being off the bike for a month to do my first recovery ride at snail's pace power, but it didn't matter. Couldn't take the smile off my face. Got my first ride in, so very happy with that.
Yeah, and my gratitude is very similar. After a pretty tumultuous 4 to 6 weeks for myself, I'm just very grateful to be running again, and exactly the same as you. It's quite such a simple thing, and I was thinking on my run yesterday that I feel like I've said this a lot on the podcast, how you're just grateful to train when you're injured, but I couldn't think of anything I'm more grateful for right now, just to be able to go for a nice, moderate length run, not have to do a 20-minute really slow run holding back. I'm just really grateful to feel the feeling of just being free and not holding back again.
One of the things I always think about is, when you're in the middle of training and everything's going well, it's a hard session, easy session, doesn't matter. And you just forget that you're fortunate to be actually able to do what you want to do. So that's kind of what my gratitude is, that for something that was taken away for whatever reason, now you can actually participate again. It just when something's taken from you, I think you appreciate it more when you can actually do it.
It's so true. When you're at the end of a hard training block, whether it's a 2 to 3 week period, you're just suffering so much. You're just desperate for some recovery or even a day off. And you do forget that when you can't do that, you're just craving being able to train hard again. Great. Our next segment is what has caught your attention?
Yeah, so we did talk about this last year. And at the start of the Grand Tours, the unpredictability of what's going to happen in 3 weeks and it was proven so true last year, because we were sort of trying to predict who was going to, the favourites for the final victory, and who could have ever predicted what the outcome was last year. None of the favourites got anywhere near winning, and the unknown guys are all vying for their first Grand Tours, and that's what panned out. So this year, I'm pretty keen to...
We're talking about the Giro here.
Yeah, sorry, the Giro. What did I say?
Nothing, just
Grand
specific.
Tours, yeah. So the Giro started, obviously, and I'm really interested to hear your prediction and my prediction on who we think possibly should be up there vying for it, and see how we go by the end of the tour. Already we've seen stage 3, the breakaway, which, in history, the last, 5 or 6 years, with teams being so organised and letting the breakaway stay out there all day and then catching them with 30K to go, 20K to go. And, last night's stage, or stage 3, a breakaway guy stayed away and he had to ride 4.5K with 30-second lead. Yeah. And the peloton absolutely stuffed it up, made a mistake, and didn't catch him, and he won by 4 seconds, and that was fantastic. A guy in his maiden Grand Tour winning a stage, and a team that had just been promoted, and a team that's not really figuring in the tours of past history. So that certainly caught my attention, A, to see what's going to happen over the tour, but B, that's another example of unpredictable results, and it's not meant to happen. It's so scripted, a lot of the Grand Tour stages. And this is one of those ones where they got it wrong. And I love seeing them muck it up, and a guy who takes a risk actually get the reward. High risk, big reward.
How often, the commentator put it perfectly, how often do you see those guys that jump at the start, the 4 guys that go away, you just look at them and go, oh, you're in for a day of hurt with no reward, and how often do you actually see them stay away? And
there you don't. You don't see them stay away because they just, because they've got race radio and, the director of sport is screaming in their ears saying, you have to get on the front and 6 or 7 teams will all make sure that their sprinters get to the finish with a chance of winning. And they absolutely mucked it up. And, he had 300 or 400 metres lead with 50 metres to go, but he had 4 or 5 metres lead when he crossed the line. That's how quick they were coming. But too late, boys. You're lost. Unreal.
So last year, you really hammered that point home about it is a 21-day effort. And just like any race, whether it's 2 minutes, 2 hours, or 21 days, you have to measure your effort. And the Giro just seems to be one where it's such a grueling event that you see the wildest fluctuations in results week to week. The top 10 in week 1 is totally different to the top 10 in week 2, and it's also totally different to the top 10 in week 3. The Tour de France, normally by about, stage 8 to 12, which is the first kind of hilly stages, the top 10 is kind of set, and then it kind of stays like that with a couple of fluctuations where you can see guys come from nowhere, come to the top 5. You can see guys in the top 5 absolutely blow up, which is why it's such an exciting race. But we really want to see who measures their effort over the next 21 days.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting thing. And look, a lot of the guys that in our coaching clients have absolutely had to face this in 1-day stages. Grafton to Inverell was on the weekend. The weekend before was Melbourne to Warrnambool. 267k ride races for masters cyclists is a massive day. As a race. And so, I'm telling them you've got to hide, you've got to really conserve and try and measure your effort from start to finish. And this is no different to a 3-week Grand Tour. You can't come out all guns blazing and ruin yourself in the first week. And the guy who's patient and picks his times when he has to spend some energy and when he doesn't, and using his team correctly. There's so much go into this because the Giro is such an unpredictable tour because it has so many weird type of 1-day stage races in a Giro Grand Tour. What does that mean? Well, 1-day races are meant to be 1-day races. You give your best on that day, whereas a Grand Tour, you're meant to, measure your effort every day and only pick the days where the team wants to ride hard. It might be in a time trial or it might be in the hills where the biggest gains can be made and you can put time into your opposition. But there's so many other days where there's opportunities for riders who, might be on the outskirts of a GC contender who can actually get massive time and make it hard for the GC riders for the rest of the tour. And that's what happened last year, and guys actually couldn't make up the time.
The word you use then, which is such a golden word, is patience, and it applies from everything to as small as your training session. If you're doing 5 efforts, 5 threshold efforts or 5 3 or 5 minute efforts, you've got to be patient because, like you always say, you feel good now at the start, but how are you going to be feeling at the end? And I really like that analogy of thinking about a training session. If you've got 5 efforts to do, the first 2, you're a lot fresher, so you're going to be feeling good, but you've still got to be so patient to not push high numbers because if you push too high, the 4th and 5th effort, you're going to absolutely fade. And it's the same in any type of race. You've just got to have that discipline to be patient and know that the subjective feeling that you have will be different at the end.
And knowing that there will be times where I really, really will need to give my biggest effort. And, that might not be near the end. It might be at a really poignant point of the race where there's a 2-minute climb and I'm talking about cycling racing here. If you've got a pack of 30-odd riders, here's an opportunity, a 2-minute climb with a 7% gradient, attack and see who you can get rid of in that peloton. Doesn't mean sit on the front and drag everybody, up behind you. It means attack, use one of your matches. And that's the art of understanding patience and knowing the course. And we've learned a lot of lessons, One of our guys, we talked about that last night when we did the post-analysis of his Grafton to Inverell. And Joe won't mind me saying this, but that's one of the lessons, not knowing the course and where the hard bits are. It's hard to do a recce of a 250k course when you live in another state. So we learnt lots of lessons about that and understanding when to use some of your matches and when not to.
Yeah, absolutely. So who are you looking forward to watching over the course of the Giro?
Remco Evenepoel I just can't wait to see what happens. And I don't want to put pressure on him by my expectation of him winning, but I just want to see all the work he's done. Everybody else has worked just as hard, except he's come back from the most horrific crash that he could have gone through. And for him to be actually back on his bike is amazing. Yeah. But I just want to see how he measures his efforts and what he does throughout the 21 days. And I really hope for his confidence, and he's just one of those talents that only comes around in 40,
Once
50
in a
years.
generation, yeah.
And that's what they've been speaking about him since he was an 18, 19-year-old, where he won world titles, in the time trial and the road race. And that's not a very common thing to have happen. And of course, he's from Belgium and the home of cycling, and they just love their cyclists, and everybody wants him to do well, and it's going to be interesting to see if he can be a Van Aert or a Van der Poel or a Alaphilippe, because he certainly has the pedigree, but he's still got to perform, and setbacks like the injury he had could prevent that from happening. His career may not be what it was meant to be, and I'm just interested to see how he handles himself over the 3-week period, because he's hardly raced since the accident. It was almost, it was pre-Giro last year, Lombardia, I think. I can't remember exactly, but I think it was. It's almost 9 or 10 or 11 months since he's raced properly. So
yeah, he'll be a good one to watch. I am also looking forward to seeing the comeback of Egan Bernal and whether he can find form again, that Tour de France winning form. That'll be great to watch, and a bit of a wild card for me, someone who I like watching. I think he's awesome on the hills, and the way he attacks them is the Bora team leader, Emmanuel Buchmann. I think he'll be really good this year. He was good at the Tour last year. He's been good at a lot of the 5-day stages, so I'm looking forward to watching him.
Yeah, one of the outsiders from the Tour de France, Hurski, who's changed teams.
Yeah.
He's certainly underperformed since then, and he was...
Yeah, he came out firing last year.
He was a contender.
Yeah.
And see how the
Mark, is it Hershey?
Hershey, yeah. It's he's jumped from Sunweb to, I can't think who he's with now, but anyway, it's going to be interesting to see how his form is from 1 year to another, because he was touted as a really the next up and coming Grand Tour rider.
Yeah. It's becoming a bit of a running joke on this podcast, our butchering of the of the European
attention to
names.
detail on names. It's not really that important, I suppose, but the general public know who we're talking
all
about.
All the Vanders and the Van Wens, and we might just start making up names. So what's caught my attention is, I was talking to you about this last week, and we still can't believe how many professional triathletes are not using power. And I was listening to a really gun Australian triathlete, and I'm not going to say the name. We're not trying to
No.
We're trying to what's the word?
Denigrate.
Yeah, denigrate anyone on this podcast. But we can't understand why you wouldn't be using every advantage possible. And this person on the podcast was saying they just don't. They tried power and they don't like it. But what was worse was the way they said they tried it, and they just said they're not a power rider. They've always gone without it, and they're going to stay without it. And the person said, I tried it for a few days. It just ruined my cycling sessions. I was jumping all over the shop. I wasn't used to it, and my coach and I decided it wasn't for me. And for me, that's just that's such a poor test to start with. I mean, of course, you're not going to be good on it for 3 days. It takes people
not
weeks.
Much of a trial.
Yeah, and there's just so much wrong with that, and you're leaving so much on the table. And I can understand why you can come to that logic that I'm so used to doing it this way. I'm comfortable doing it this way. Change is hard. I don't want to ruin a thing that's working. And there is a saying that don't fix it if it isn't broken, especially this triathlete does win a lot. But, if Usain Bolt had an opportunity to go faster, just because he's the fastest in the world, he still can get faster. It's worth doing, so...
There's so much in this, and these are only our observations, and we're just highlighting it. I think we're frustrated that person could be a better cyclist, but they're very happy with the form they've got now. So it's easy to say, I don't need it because I'm doing very well. And I remember when power first came in, I think it would have been 2001 or 2. I actually was fortunate enough to ride with Cadell Evans. And I've told this story before, where he had a power meter and I had no idea what he was doing. He was doing a training session. I was just riding behind him. It was just him and I at the back of Bowen Heads, and he said what he was going to do for the session, and he was going to ride to power, and it was amazing what he was doing in that session and the accuracy to what he was riding at. Because we've always just gone by feel or heart rate. And no one would be using power if it was not an advantage. And it's clearly an advantage. And we've explained that so many times in the podcast. So for you to not take up that option because you think you're doing okay at the moment, I just think you're missing out. And it's kind of frustrating and disappointing, and you feel for that person. Just give it a chance. And give
it a proper chance.
And if after a month you still don't think it's for you, then absolutely don't use it. But boy,
I still don't think a month's enough time, to be honest.
But you know how hard it is to actually understand how to train them and race to power.
Yeah.
It's not something that, there's so much involved in understanding how power works to your advantage, how it stops you from, as a triathlete, from going too hard early, how before you do the event that what you're capable of for doing 90K power number or 180K power number. You know that before you go into the event. So you pretty much know what your plan is from start to finish. And going outside of that plan either way is fraught with danger. So you're taking all the risk out of your result. It might sound boring, but without that knowledge, you are risking having a disastrous race.
And that was one of the main points this triathlete made, was that I am such an experienced athlete. I know what pace to run at. I know what speed to ride at. I know what it feels like. I've got such a good sense of feel that I can do it. And that might be true, but there's two major problems with that. One is the point you just made, is that you still are risking your feel being off that day, because it could be off. You could have a bad day subjectively because you've got your feelings mixed up of how you think the pace is going.
And that's a good point, because the power doesn't care how you feel.
Exactly.
The power is just a number.
Yeah.
And it's got no relationship to feel.
So even if you're really experienced, you can still make mistakes, whereas the power is going to be there, black and white, no matter what. So you're eliminating that risk. And the second part on that subjective feeling is that how you feel, we just spoke about this at the start of the podcast, is subject to the context of that day, that week. Some days you might be feeling really good, and so you're fresher, but it forces you to go out too hard. Some days you might be feeling worse just because you're tired, you've had a flat week, it's not your on day, and so if you're relying on that, you're really relying on such subjective measures, and it takes a lot of mental strength to get through that, and it's unnecessary mental battle that you don't need to be doing on the day.
And you've heard me get frustrated with when I say to people, why did you go out so hard when you went above your range that we talked about? And the sentence I hate is, but Gerard, I felt so good at the start. And I've talked about this many times. Of course you feel good because you've well tapered for this event, and it's only the beginning of a 90K or 180K ride. Of course you're going to feel fantastic because you're meant to be fresh at the start. But the feelings of 200 watts in the first 20K compared to the feelings of 200 watts at 160K, they are completely different feelings. Yeah. So that's why the power meter is such an advantage. So it stops you at the start from riding to how you feel. I feel great, let's ride at 250 watts. But if I didn't use a power meter, I wouldn't know that I'm doing that 50 watts higher. I'm going to pay for that when I get to 160K and I can't ride 140 watts. And I feel like I'm still riding well, but actually my watts is 100 watts lower than it should be. And that's the thing that I try and get across to people who actually don't believe in power. And I got told by another cyclist 10, 15 years ago, I don't need power. I've been riding like this for 25 years. I know exactly how my body works. I don't need a machine to tell me what to do. And that person now uses power in every single session they do. And,
and preaches by it.
Yeah, exactly. And once they understood what power was actually going to do for them, the benefits of it, they had to swallow their pride and go, well, I still ride with lots of good feel about what I'm doing in any particular training session and day, but I understand what my feeling is relatable to a number. Yeah. And look, there's going to be some days where 200 watts feels like you're riding through butter, slicing through butter. It's easy. And another day, 200 watts feels like you're into a headwind. Yeah. It's so difficult, but that's the beauty of understanding feel to a number.
Yeah, and as always, that's such an important point, because we're not just saying it's number or nothing. You're using everything. You're using your power as well as how you're feeling compared to your heart rate for that day, but to just ignore power completely is a massive disadvantage.
Yeah, so the point you made was you're surprised that people who are at the elite end of their sport aren't using the tools that are available. And honestly, they would be performing better if they did. And I'm not just saying that because I'm keen on power. I'm just saying that because that's fact.
Yeah.
You will do better with more information.
Yeah. Anyway, it's just our observations, and I think we would both love to be able to analyze their training and race data with power, just to see what was happening, see if they were just going out fractionally harder than they needed to in their racing training compared to the end.
Yeah, but look, even when I look at data from our own athletes, no matter how much I drill it into them, say we're doing a 90K and your first 45, it's an out and back. It should be, say you're doing 2 hours 20. So you want to do an hour 10 for the first out and back and an hour 10 for the second out and back. That's the goal, to have 2 even rides. And forever we see an hour 6 and an hour 14. They end up with 2 hours 20, which is the result they wanted. But how they got there is going to make their run so painful because they're fading.
Yep.
To be 8 minutes slower, I'm using examples here.
Yep.
Some people are, a 1 hour 9 and a 1 hour 11. And, the further you are away from an even split is going to put your run under pressure.
Yep, absolutely. And the point you touched on before about how you feel at the start compared to the end, anyone that's done any type of endurance event will know that when you're running an endurance event at the start, you need to your intensity is going to be at a 5 out of 10. It's not going to be that high, but a 5 out of 10 at the end feels like you're pushing a 7 or 8 out of 10. So it's just this gradual burn that slowly makes your legs heavier and heavier. If you're running a half marathon or a marathon, it's the effort it takes to run that 5 out of 10 after 2 hours it's just incredible how much harder it feels.
A great science experiment would be to maybe do a run or a ride in a lab, do it on a treadmill, and you get questioned as you're running or questioned as you're riding, and you're not allowed to see the power, and you have to run for 4 minutes at 7 out of 10. And everybody knows you're not allowed to look at your watch. You got to go by feel, and you've got to ride at 200 watts, and you understand the feel of 7 out of 10 power. And then you ride at 9, and you've got to give the answers all the time as to how you feel. And if it was an endurance type activity science test, you would definitely people would be saying, "Oh, this feels like I'm actually running much harder now or riding much harder." But if we uncovered the lap power or we uncovered the average pace, you would find that it's probably dropped.
Yep.
And that would be fun to see. What people's feel is compared to what the actual real data is.
It is a common practice in tests, and I'm 100% certain there would be a test out there that has done exactly that, so I might make it my mission to find it. But I've played that game with myself on any endurance run, because in an endurance run I try not to look at the watch. I'm just running freely, just running easily. But towards the end I start to guess what pace I'm running, and it's crazy how far off I am. What feels like a 440 pace, I look down and it's 455 or 5 minutes, because your legs are so much heavier.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, moving on to the main topic, bike versus run training. Well, let's start by going through what are the types of sessions that you can do, because you can do similar style training on the bike and run. So let's just give an overview of the types of sessions that you can do, and then we'll get specifically into what's probably better for a bike or run session for a triathlete.
Okay, so where do I start with these sessions? There's just so many sessions you can do as a runner or as a rider. So let's just give some basic general sessions that you could actually attempt to do if you're trying to improve yourself as a rider or runner.
Underneath each of these general headings, there is a subset of sessions you can do, but we're just going to kind of...
There is. So, the obvious number one thing is if you're an endurance runner or rider, you need to do an endurance session. Yeah. You would probably, as an endurance athlete, be faced with hills, whether you're a rider or a runner in an endurance event. So you would want to have some strength component into your training sessions. Obviously, you would want to have some recovery rides or runs so that you can actually do the other sessions that you're trying to do well to get the improvement as you go along your training journey to race day. So we break that the other sessions into, so we've got endurance, we've got strength, and we've got recovery, and then the important sessions that are going to give us the improvement are some type of interval over-under type riding or running, threshold type riding or running, sweet spot, which is just under threshold riding or running, and to a lesser degree, tempo. We don't do a lot of zone 3 tempo riding or running. But we do a lot of zone 2, which is really underneath that tempo, but not near the sweet spot. So zone 2 type of activity where it's, you could be talking as an athlete to your buddy who you're training with, whereas tempo, you would be a little bit more out of breath. So it's just under that tempo. So that's a generalisation of some sessions that you should have implemented into your program.
It's important to understand that each type of session you're doing is hitting a different zone, which is hitting a different physiological part of the body and training a different part of the body. And you need to hit these different zones to get your body to adapt and improve.
Yeah. And, if we're talking zones, zone 1 is recovery, zone 2 is that just pressure on the pedal. Zone 3 is more tempo-y. Zone 4 is that sweet spot 2 threshold. Zone 5 is the VO2 where we're 110 to 120% of our threshold. And then zone 6, 7, 5, 6, 7 are all, short bursts of intensity under a minute.
Depending on what FTP formally used, there's zone 5, 6, 7. There's sometimes people call it zone 5 A, B or C.
Yep, and there's every exercise physiologist has got his own neuromuscular zone or whatever they want to call it. But basically, we're talking about anything from 120% of your threshold and above. And so we've got so many opportunities to do variations of training, and it's dependent on so many things. Questions like, am I an experienced runner? Am I an experienced rider? Am I at the pointy end of the results? Am I a mid-packer or am I a beginner? So your sessions will all be determined by where you sit in answering those questions.
Also, thinking about the event and then what stage of the program you're up to.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why the progressive overload component that we want everybody to have in their program is so important.
So really, the major kind of 4 factors, if we were to summarise it, are what are your experience? What's your experience? You're a beginner, intermediate, or very experienced triathlete. Where do you sit in terms of the results? Are you trying to win? Are you trying to just improve yourself? Or are you trying to just finish and compete? What's the actual event that you're doing? So what is the length of event that you need to train for? That definitely impacts the zones you want to hit a lot more, because a Ironman athlete does not need to be hitting zone 5C or zone 7 for the same thing. 130% of efforts that often. They don't need to spend very little time doing that. And what stage of the program are you at? Are you starting the program? Are you in your final phase leading to the race?
No, that's a really great summary, and that point 4 is that is such a crucial one, because we've told people on this podcast that if you're training for an Ironman, you don't need to be doing 200-meter sprints as a runner, because what are the requirements of the event? Well, certainly there's no sprinting in it. You might sprint for 10 metres if you're actually trying to beat someone to win Kona as a professional. Yeah. You might sprint for 100 metres, but that's about the only time you're going to be sprinting. So there's actually no benefit to your training program to have that in it. So that's kind of one of the things that I see that people doing a lot of, which is not necessary for an endurance event.
Yeah, and this brings up a really good point, because there are so many sessions you could do, and you probably see a lot of athletes doing good sessions. On their own, they're good sessions, but they're not very good sessions for that person's program. They might have gone and done a great, track session where they've done 16 200s or something, and that's a really good session if they can do it, but it's completely unnecessary because they're training for an Ironman.
Yeah, and that's kind of the points we're trying to get here across is, identifying those 4 factors will enable you to get the right outcome for the program you're trying to achieve.
So let's turn to the main question of this episode, and that's, what is the difference between bike and run training? And we at Trivelo generally don't prescribe things based on the physiological adaptation side of things first. It's actually more a different factor. It's actually a risk factor first.
Yeah, and I've just seen too many people. The reason why we do this is because I've just seen too many people not get to the start line. And it doesn't matter what you give them as a training program. If you don't get to the start line, it's worth nothing. So you're not achieving anything. You're not going to have a great day, a PB, a poor day, or an average day. You're actually not going to have any day. So we try and eliminate the risk. And what is the risk? The risk is doing the sessions bike and run around the wrong way, or doing them equally the same. And you've got to understand that as a triathlete, you actually need to put the risk. The biggest risk is in running. There's very little risk in riding. Of course, there's crashing risk. There's straining muscles risk, obviously. Sore backs, hamstrings, maybe calves, but you're not susceptible to an activity that's basically around gravity where you're holding yourself up. So what are we trying to achieve in that summary of sessions that I talked about? VO2 threshold, sweet spot. We need to get that overload to improve as an athlete. To become a better athlete, you need to push yourself. So we're trying to minimise that in running and put it into the riding or the swimming. We want to get your cardiovascular pumping really hard, not in the running session. We still want you to have a great base of fitness in the running session. So we do lots of sessions, but really one of them's only got some intensity, and all the other sessions have just got a base building component to them where we're trying to improve your aerobic fitness.
Yeah.
And we obviously use things such as hills to get the cardiovascular pumping a little bit, where we're not striding out fast. The minute you start running fast is the minute you're risking calf, hamstring, tears, plantar fasciitis, you name it. You're going to get a myriad of issues from running fast, hitting the pavement fast. Running uphill, you actually can't run fast, but you're getting that same cardiovascular response by it. If you run up a set of stairs, you're puffing by the top. But you haven't gone fast up the stairs. You run up a hill fast, you're not going very fast, but you're still getting a cardiac outcome response.
Yeah, you're able to hit the high intensity anaerobic zone or system
without running fast.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's the thing we're trying to say here. You still need to train as a runner really well, and the difference between training as a runner and a triathlete runner, that's another topic as well. A lot of the sessions we've talked about, they are perfect for runners who just are runners. But as a triathlete, you've got, so many things happening with your body from swimming and so many things happening with your body from riding that by the time you get to run, the fatigue levels are enormous, and overuse causes injury. So if you're avoiding overuse as a runner and doing all the hard work as a rider and getting those sprint efforts on the bike, those 30-second efforts, 15-second efforts, 1-minute efforts on the bike, really maxing out, you're minimising the risk, but you're still getting the value.
Yeah.
So you don't need to repeat those sessions as a runner because you're already doing it in your program. So let's not repeat. I'm a big advocate of not repeating sessions on the bike. If you're just a bike rider, don't repeat sessions. You've got no time in your daily week to repeat sessions. So we don't want to actually do the same sessions as a runner, and we've already done them on the bike. So we need to use the running section to get our base and our aerobic fitness. And we need to use the bike section to get our overload. So be expecting to ride hard on the bike. And because we only possibly ride 3 times a week for some age groupers we're talking about, you've got to get bang for your buck here. One of them is going to be endurance and 2 of them are going to be reasonably intense. So they may be over threshold, they may be at threshold, they may be a combination of over-under.
Yeah.
Depends on where you are in the program. If you're towards the end, you'll be doing shorter, harder, high intensity. If you're at the beginning of the program, you're doing your base training. So you'll be doing less high intensity stuff, more sweet spot. So, the question we said at the start, there is so many variations to the answer that you're saying, the difference between training on the bike and training as a runner. So I'm trying to go through them and try to make it as simple as possible. But at the end of the day, if you can understand this one concept, use the bike to get the intensity and you will get to the start line. That's actually the goal, is not to be injured. We want you to get to the start line. If you haven't done a lot of high intensity running, it's absolutely fine as long as you've got a great aerobic running base. Yeah. Because you have got so many examples that you know of people who we've trained purely as runners. We've got them doing, they're doing trail runs that are 15 hours, 150K runs through the Blue Mountains, for example, one of our athletes. We gave them, 2-hour runs, 3-hour runs, all the way up to 8-hour runs, split runs, 8 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, in preparation for that 15-hour trail run that they were doing. We tested them over 10K half marathon and they smashed their PBs on a 10K without doing any intervals. And, that tells me that, you can still perform very well by doing, a specific type of training that's going to allow you to not get injured, and you will still be able to run fast.
This comes down to the science behind how adaptive the athlete is, which we won't go into now because it is a very complex topic on its own. But you can assume that the PBs in that 10K and half marathon come because the athlete isn't a fully adapted athlete yet, so they're going to get improvements no matter what zone they train in, but they're getting massive improvements by doing so much of that zone 1-2 training, whereas a professional triathlete who's been training for 20 years in the sport, who is at the very peak, who is trying to get 0.1% improvement, they need to train in the exact right zone. They need to train this many minutes in zone 5A and this many minutes in zone 5B and this many minutes in zone 3 or 4 to get that incremental improvement. But really, from a general perspective, not many age group athletes are going to be that well adapted. So just getting a general mix of this first, while abiding by our number one principle, lowering the risk of injury, is one of the best outcomes.
Yeah, and when we say they just do endurance training, the example I was giving, they're still doing hill work, which is, as we said before, stimulating their cardio system so that they're able to run fast when they want to run a 10K or a 5K. They can still run fast because they've been doing these strength efforts on hills. So the point you've made is valid across everything we're talking about, and especially when you're at the pointy end and you're trying to get those 1% improvements, then that's where it's so much more important to spend X amount of time in the right zone and not waste any of that training that you're, one of the examples I give is when I started to prepare for the 90K individual time trial, which was so different to the training I'd been doing for the last 20 years as a cyclist, last 15 years as a cyclist who does criterium, small time trials and road racing. And for me to change my focus to time trial training of an endurance type, whereas the time trials in cycling is all around 15 or 20 Ks, whereas now I'm looking at a 90K time trial. My focus became on that sweet spot, just under threshold. I still did the high intensity stuff to get my functional threshold power to go up, but there was no tempo riding, zero. There was sweet spot, 88 to 96%. That's where I spent a lot of my time training. So that's what's going to happen on race day.
Yep.
But a lot of it was in zone 1 and 2 the other days.
Yep.
And the other high intensity sessions, I was doing, 30-15s, 40-20s, 60-30s. They were the go-to sessions because I was riding them at 120% or more.
Yep.
And that's where my body adapted so well to everything that was being thrown at it. And come race day, riding at 80 to 90% of your threshold felt like a piece of cake after doing those high intensity sessions. But your aerobic fitness, I was shocked at how quickly my body adapted to being able to ride. And I'm saying quickly. It took nearly 6 months of changing the program to really focus on this. But I was always wondering, what I was able to ride as a 60-year-old compared to what I could ride as a professional triathlete when I was 28, 29, 30, 31. Of course, we had different bikes, but I, as to ride around that 210 to 214, that transcribes to a 440 to 450. I couldn't do that as a 28-year-old. That was similar to what I could do.
Yeah.
But because I'm understanding the concepts of training better now, and of course the bike is the difference.
Yeah.
Being able to ride a faster bike. So it just shows you how important the bike is. But it was intriguing to me that I could ride those times, 30 years later.
Yeah. You've always said you'd love to go back in time with your current bike and see what you could do as a 28-year-old.
Yeah, and I'd definitely run better because I wouldn't be as fatigued because of riding a road bike compared to riding a time trial bike. But getting away from the topic there, but it was just understanding, the requirements of your event. What are you training for? And implementing the key things that the event requirements are in your program. But you still need all the other things that we talked about at the start, which is, types of intensity, types of zone 2, types of zone 1, endurance, strength work. They still, doesn't matter what event you're doing, you still need aspects of it. Yep. But you need to concentrate on more of, and I don't mean repeating, I just mean more time in the one session that's more relevant to your event. And if you're doing Peaks Ride, it's a 4,500 metre ride with climbs. You just need to spend more time doing hills and strength work. That would be, your endurance ride would have that in it, and you would have another session where you're doing high intensity. Your endurance ride, not doing the strength work at high intensity, you're doing it at the tempo you're going to ride on that actual particular day. So you would ride some of those 1 hour climbs at 75 to 80%, because you're doing a 10-hour event. So you'd ride those climbs if they're an hour at 75 to 80%. And every time you get to one of those climbs, that's what your go-to would be. So you'd practice that in training. So you wouldn't be doing your endurance ride with high intensity at that level. You would do your strength efforts at, 6x5 at 98 to 108%. So that's where you're getting your improvement from at the strength effort.
Yeah.
So you're still doing two strength efforts, but they're different.
Yeah.
One's got intensity, one hasn't.
Yeah.
But people say, you're repeating strength efforts. Well, no, I'm not. I'm repeating the actual cadence replicator, but not the intensity.
And that's what we said at the start. We talk about the general headline of a type of session. So you've got a tempo session or a strength session, but underneath that there is 10 different types of strength sessions you can do depending on the length of the effort, depending on the recovery, depending on the cadence you choose, the percent gradient of the hill. It creates an entirely different session depending on all those factors. And not to confuse anyone, as soon as you start talking about percentages, 75 to 80%, 98 to 108%, it can easily, people can go, I don't know what that even means or what that's in reference to. The main point we're making here, and bringing it back to bike versus run training, is that you want to minimize the risk of what your run training is doing first and foremost, and then make sure you are getting the best benefit from the sessions possible, but while minimizing the risk of injury. On the flip side of this coin, like we said at the start, we do see a lot of athletes take that too far, and on the bike just to do too much of the same session. So just do too much of the same over-under session and not get enough variety in there, not get enough endurance or not get enough sweet spot, sub-threshold or threshold riding, and same thing for running. You do want to minimize the amount of time you are spending at intensity. So really, as a triathlete doing a 70.3 or Ironman endurance event, you want to be spending as little time as possible at zone 5, 6 or 7. There's just no need to run that fast. But you do want to be getting some overload. And so you do want to be getting some sort of over-under session, just not at high risk. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's spot on what you just said. And what the guys are doing too much on the bike and too much on the run, they need to swap it. So there's too much one single paced training happening as a runner. And people say, oh no, that's rubbish. I do intervals. Well, that's actually, intervals are running way over threshold with recovery. And what we're trying to do here is, the true monofartlek, which is just over your threshold and just under. And that's more relevant for a triathlete. As a runner, no one does over-under. They do either hard intervals and recovery, and that's not over-under. That's 4 minutes or 6 minutes intervals with 2 minute recovery. Over under is doing, 30 seconds or 1 minute or 90 seconds over. And then when we say over, we might be saying if your go-to pace is 4 minute K pace, you might do them at 3:55 for 90 seconds. And then the next 90 seconds you do at 4:05. So just under and just over. And not as if you're doing 6-1K reps where you're actually running, 3:30 and having a 5 minute jog in between. That's not the over-under we're talking about. Whereas as a cyclist, that's what we do all the time, because we ride in bunches where people are attacking and surging, you get a recovery, you go again. That happens at almost every bunch ride that you do. And we don't do a lot of threshold riding as cyclists, and we need to do more of that so that, we've got that weapon. If you get to a hill, it's a 10-minute hill and you've done only over-under, you're going to go up the hill resting and surging and resting and surging. And that's a good tactic if you're trying to get rid of people. But you need to hold steady state at threshold and practice that. Yep. And if you come to a race where you've never done that, you're going to be found out. And that's the one thing I push cyclists to do when they come to me is they're great at over-under, but they've done no threshold training. Why? Because it's too hard and it's painful. And I just don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So can I do the things I really enjoy? Yeah, you can, but once. And let's do the other thing.
It is a more boring session, just sitting there holding sustained power. You much prefer to be a bit more exciting and go hard for 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't know about boring, John. I think it's excruciating. But I know that it's actually helping me. So I'm happy I'm not happy. I know the outcome meets the requirement of what I'm trying to do. If I can sit and hold 102% for 4 by 8 minutes, then 32 minutes at that. I come away with that with enormous confidence that I am actually improving my threshold, which is going to make me a better bike rider. And if I'm a triathlete, the same thing.
Yeah. I'm glad we finished with this point, because if you say this at the start, then people might think, oh no, well, I've got to go do over-under running. And that's not exactly what we're saying. You want to do over-under running, but in a risk-averse way, like the monophilic example you gave. So the first point to notice is that you want to, just to summarize this really clearly to finish off, you want to get a variety of all the sessions hitting different zones depending on your event, your experience, what you're aiming for. But you want to do it in a risk-averse way. And then the flip side of that coin, which we've just finished with, is make sure you're not doing too much of the one session, and you are not just doing over-under on bike and not just doing tempo or threshold running.
Yeah, that's a great summary, and I really can't add much more to that, because we just don't want to confuse people. And I know people are really gleaning everything we're saying, and that's great. But you've got to understand that at the end of the day, if you don't get to the start line because you've been too risky with running fast, then you're going to really be disappointed and be mad at yourself, because we've told you on this podcast that actually doesn't work. And who does it work for? It works for people who have been running for a long time, and they can still get injured, by the way. But, the better the aerobic base you have, the more able you are to do that one session per week that will stretch you. But it should only be one. And that's kind of the message I want to take home is if you're new to running, you haven't done a lot of running, you shouldn't be doing any of that. You should just be spending your whole time, whether it's 6 months down the track or 2-year program that you've got for an Ironman, you want to start to do some sprints, then Olympics, then half Ironmans and Ironman, you should not be doing any intensity in your running. You should use that on the bike. That's kind of the message we want to get home, so that you can get to races. And I know the question's going to be, but if I want to do really fast runs in races, I haven't done any of that in my training. Well, as we said, you get that from the bike.
Mm-hmm. And also, if the event is a 70.3 Ironman, you're not going to be spending much time running fast.
That's right. I was more talking about the sprints and Olympic, exactly. But yeah, definitely. I think it's pretty simple. Follow those pieces of advice, and you'll get to start more races than you would have not had you joined in the masses who do flat out training. 6x400 to the training for an Ironman or a half Ironman, and they get injured and they never get to the start line. So. And even the people who train correctly with not much intensity still have the possibility of getting injured. And, that's where the other component of, looking after yourself with strength and conditioning, making sure that if you have a weakness in your hamstring, that you actually do something about it. Yeah. You've got to be proactive in preventing injuries so that you don't just be proactive when the injuries come. Yeah. It's got to be a maintenance thing that's part of your training.
Yeah. That's a really good way to finish off. That's a great end to this episode. And on that note, we're really excited for the next month of episodes we've got coming up on the podcast. Coming up, we have actually someone on that exact topic. We've got a movement specialist, someone that we trust as the movement specialist here at Trivelo, to talk about injury prevention and how to improve your body in a way that maximizes your potential to keep training and avoid injury. And so that's going to be really exciting. We also have a bike specialist coming on, teaching you how to get the best out of your bike. We've got a really inspiring comeback story, an interview with someone very close to Trivelo that we can't wait to show you. So some really good episodes coming up on the podcast. We can't wait for you to hear them. And other than that, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.